I'm going to talk about World War One. I'll tell you about the sides and how World War One kind of started and ended. All right, but it's not called World War One, not yet. It's called the Great War, because World War Two hadn't happened. So here is a world map right here. It's kind of small. It shows the sides. The green is the Allied powers. This is when all the countries had joined. And then the red is the Allied powers. Actually, oops. They're the Central powers. And then this is some of the countries are neutral, the tan. And then this is a zoom up on what first started the year of Europe. This is Europe. Okay, and same colors, but these light green ones and light red ones, they did not join at first. They were still neutral until like Portugal and Austria-Hungary and Italy and Greece and a lot more countries. They didn't join till later in the war, but they're still in Europe. All right. So, a lot of those countries had been building up their navies and armies and all that. So that was like a stick of dynamite. And then this guy right here, Gavrilo Princip, he assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was in his car and they were going down the street and he went like this. Shot him dead. He shot him twice. And they caught him. He's right here. But he's like the fire that sparked the stick of dynamite to make the whole world explode. And then they started fighting each other. Because they were like, it all started because that Austro-Hungarian, he was the heir to the throne. And so when he got shot, it really made things terrible. The Central Powers, Austro-Hungary would join the Central Powers later, but they were angry, and the guy who shot him, he was very, very young. He was probably 25 or something. That's my best guess. And he had a 20-year sentence. He died of tuberculosis. All right, so back into the war. As they started fighting, a lot of people thought it would be over by Christmas. But they were wrong. Because there was a bunch of trenches. These explosions, they're battles, and that happened there. But on Christmas Day, the two sides, they were fighting in the trenches, and there were very terrible conditions. You can look; those are terrible. And a lot of the soldiers, they didn't die by getting shot. They died by diseases because they were stuck in the trenches for so long. But on Christmas, they decided not to fight each other, and they played a big game of football, and the Allied side won. And they gave each other all presents. But then the sad thing is, the next day after that, they had to fight each other. And then they started getting more, they started making new weapons, like machine guns, and this thingy right here, this thing would be loaded into it and it would shoot it and then it would explode. And this guy is chucking a bomb. And this statue of Mary, it's hanging right here because it got knocked down. And then they started getting a better navy. And a lot of the navies, they were starting to crack the codes, and so they could know what they were doing. Like this guy, he has his flags, those are the codes, and sometimes one of the sides would steal the other side's code book, and so they would know. And then they would be like, oh no, they already know what we're doing. And they had a lot better, look, this ship, that's a big ship. They got better ships, and these are all the battles. And then this is a naval battle, sinking ships. And then these ships, they're the naval bases. And a lot of the naval battles were a lot more worse because they were dealing with a lot of weapons that they built. They would put on their boats, and then they would be fighting against each other with like on the ground, but it's on the water. And then they started making, a lot of the soldiers were dying, and then the countries were like, we need more soldiers. And they were like, we need soldiers like you. Like, see this guy? He's like, Britons wants you, join your country's army. And if you were 18 or older, they would force you to join the army. They would put your name in a thing, and if it got pulled out, then you were in the army. And a lot of people signed up when they were younger because they wanted to fight in the war. But once they started fighting in the war, they realized we don't want to fight in this war anymore. Because a lot of these people are just in the trenches with. There's some pictures of the trenches right here. These blue ones, there's a reserve trench or in the back. That's where like all the food is, I guess. And then the support trench is where all the guys who weren't fighting up here. And the fire trench, which is where you shoot the guys. They're the support trench, so when the guys died in the fire trench, the guys in the support trench would go up and they would go in the fire trench. And there's also communication trenches. They've got walkie-talkies so they can communicate to the other guys in the communication trenches to see what's happening and if they need some stuff. Alright, they had a lot of trench battles until they got some better, like those machine guns, tanks, cannons. That's when they started having less trenches and more just running out and shooting. And a lot of the armies were really depressed, and they would get shell shocked and they would get really badly injured, but they had to keep up their good morale. And so when it was daylight, they didn't just go and attack. They would play a game where there's two soldiers dressing up as a horse right here. And they would get a helmet and they would pretend the horse was eating from it. A lot of the generals would have these houses, and they would have these fancy dinners and all that stuff while all their leaders were back at their bases they were just like, all right, Captain, you take these soldiers and go attack Britain, or something like that. And they would just sit there doing nothing. Like, the thing why do we fight wars when the leaders, they're just staying there? But why do we fight against each other? Because the soldiers have nothing to do with what happened. It's the guys who are the leaders of the country. So it doesn't really make sense why we fight against each other so much. And then, after that, there were some more inventions. There were air inventions. So, like, they did have some airplanes, but they weren't very high tech. Like, this thing is like a blimp or something. But this guy, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, he named this thing the Zeppelin after him. He invented it. And you would go in here, and this thing would like have bombs in it, and then you would drop bombs on a lot of other people. And this is a Zeppelin LL3 right there. That's the like you know how we have skeletons? That's like the skeleton of it. They're inspecting it. And they were like angry giants. The Zeppelin guy, he built an airship that could fly higher than their fighters, which was better. And they were developing a lot new bombers. That's why they would hold the bombs and the Zeppelins. They're a lot bigger, and they could go higher over the cities and drop bombs. And since all the men were out fighting in the war, the women had to take over their jobs. And it was a lot harder, especially there's a lot of people out in the war. So, like, no one has any jobs. All the businesses would go down, and no one would have food unless the women would keep them up. And so that's what they had to do. And also, the women, they would build like airplanes and guns and tanks, stuff like that. And then a lot more of the war happened, but in the winter it was a lot worse because they can't dig trenches in the winter because the ground is frozen. And so they had to, and they couldn't really build anything because the winds were so bad. And so when they were sleeping, they just had to sleep and pray that they wouldn't die during the night. Like, see, there's a lot of people carrying their snowshoes and all that. Look at that long line of soldiers just marching to go battle. And they would go battle, but half of them would have already died when they've already got there to try and battle. And it was terrible. It was just so terrible. And then they had a lot more battles, just fighting over and over. And finally, the Central Powers surrendered. And then they were forced to sign a treaty. So they had to pay a bunch of money to the other countries. But that made Germany in a terrible position. And then that's when Hitler came in and he was like, we need someone to fight against. He was like, I'll direct your anger towards the Jews. And that's what started World War II. because the Germans were so angry. Well, that's the beginning and the end of World War I.